Hi, everyone, and welcome to CDO Magazine series of one-on-one interviews with CDOs, data leaders, and key influencers. I'm your host, Robert Lutton, Vice President, Sandhill Consultants, coming to you today from Toronto, Canada, working on behalf of the CDO Magazine. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Lauren Maffeo, who is the senior, if I get it right, the senior tech service designer at SteamPunk and author of the recent Designing Data Governance from the Ground Up book. Welcome, Lauren.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Obviously, if you've got any advice or what advice you have for organizations looking to start to implement a data governance program, the first thing I would suggest is obviously purchase your book, share this with your team. But from your point earlier on in the interview, you mentioned that you still see a lot of organizations out there are really still trying to mature their data governance programs. That may have something, may be disjointed, it may be in different aspects. But what advice would you kind of provide to organizations that are at that early stage in implementing data governance?
I think that there's a real lack of visibility into all of the ways that data is used across organizations today. You can be the CDO, the most senior data leader in your organization, and by virtue of your title, your day-to-day responsibilities, your maybe disconnect from the rest of the organization, it can be very difficult to have a full picture of how data is truly used across the organization. If you invest in building relationships with folks across the organization and across departments to really ask honest questions about how data is being used today, what it's being used for, what the key challenges are. I think those conversations really go a long way. They especially go a long way if you are new in a role, because no one wants a new leader who is going to come in and make a lot of sweeping changes, especially if those people do it very soon without truly understanding the business they've been hired to transform. And so if you are new in a CDO role, I think your first order of business really should be to start speaking with employees across business areas, across roles, across seniority, to understand the state of data use within that business today. You will very likely not be coming in to invite data from scratch. The reality is that your new organization already has more data than they can handle, and there is already a lot of technical debt regarding data. And so that does need to be addressed. You will not have a perfect data set that you can just implement for every scenario. That doesn't exist. So instead, you have to figure out how is data being used today and what is the experience of interacting with data today. Once you have a clearer picture of that, I think then you have the foundation for a governance plan long term.
So for our CDOs, you just mentioned our CDOs, and we mentioned it a while back, that in your opinion, the role that you believe the chief data officer can play in building a data governance program is being that business, taking on that business strategy role. Any additional advice for the CDO in helping them address and build their data governance program?
The main piece of advice I have for a CDO building a data governance program is to find an executive sponsor who can support all of your efforts, both verbally when you're not in the room and also fiscally by giving you the right budget to execute governance. And I say this because the CDO role is, of course, a C-suite one, but it's very common for data leaders to feel minimized and tokenized, I think, because they are still expected to do all things with data regardless of the budget that's available to them. And I think if they are not supported by the most senior leader in an organization, then ultimately they can do some work. They might be able to drive some change, but that change will be limited. And so I would say when folks are interviewing for CDO roles, to ask the CEO and COO pretty honest questions about what they perceive data to do for their businesses and what they think the value is. I think it's always exciting to come into an organization and think you're going to transform everything and drive this really incredible change. But the reality is that if you don't have the most senior leadership on board with your vision, you'll ultimately be able to do very little. And so that really starts at the interview process, where you talk to people about their vision for data governance, and then figuring out if it's a fit for you. Assuming that it is, one of the first things I think CDOs should do is find a sponsor for their data governance efforts, because having that senior most support is really going to be invaluable.
Yes, and for our CDOs listening, we hope that you have the appropriate sponsorship and the appropriate support that you need in the organization. One of the things that may help you is another question that I wanted to ask is, in your opinion, how do you think data governance can help the organization make better data-driven decisions?
I think governance helps organizations make better decisions about data because it gives everyone more transparency into the state of data in an organization. One of the biggest challenges I see doing this work is that data is so siloed that even people who are in technical roles don't always have a full picture of which data sets are being utilized for which projects, owned by whom, deployed in which environments, living on which servers. That lack of transparency, it not only decreases trust, but it makes it almost impossible to do your work, because if there's no documentation for where data lives or how it's managed, you will not be able to do a whole lot with it. And so I think the first step towards recognizing how beneficial data governance is to really get granular about where data lives and how it's being used today. That's really the basis for chapter 4 of the book, where you have to look at and be honest about the state of data in the organization today. And it's probably going to be a painful process that reveals a lot of things which could be done better. But that's the point of the exercise. And that's really the starting point for moving forward, because if you don't know where your data lives today, it's impossible to figure out where you want it to go tomorrow.
I noticed there was a section in the book talking about embedding data governance into engineering practices. Any suggestions for our audience out there, and a quick sort of tidbit that you might want to look at to help them out? Obviously, read the book, but any kind of advice that you've got for them.
Yeah, there's an example from the Netflix case study I use in that chapter, which really stuck out at me. It was talking about doing a big data migration to a new type of architecture that was the right type of architecture for for the vision Netflix had for its future and for its users. But that new type of architecture was largely unproven, and it was very tenuous. And because it was new, the engineering team at hand did not have a lot of experience using it. And
Right.
so what that engineering team lead chose to do was he chose to give his team room to experiment with the new technology and fail in a sandbox environment, so that they would not only gain familiarity with the Kafka clusters they had to use, but also so that they would be able to gain that experience in an environment that did not hurt Netflix users. If your users know that you're doing a data migration, it's almost always a guarantee that something went wrong, because they don't know when things are working well, but they do know when things fail. The Southwest meltdown is another example of that. You don't know when systems are working well, but you know when they're not. And so likewise with this, in this case at Netflix, I was really struck by that example, because especially if you've worked in waterfall environments, you are very used to those sprint retros where you look at how things went, but you are not allowed to discuss failure during the implementation process, especially if it's waterfall, because then you by default have one task and so many dependencies underneath it, and so it's thought of as being too big to fail. And the reality is, if you do not find ways to incorporate data experimentation into your engineering practices, you will again decrease trust. You will not give people the familiarity with data that they ultimately need, and you will, I believe, ultimately not allow the business and your users to reach their full potential. Conversely, though, giving that opportunity and room to experiment and fail in that part of the process is really valuable. And I think that can be a real lesson for how to manage your data team and your engineering team as they're maybe getting used to automating these new standards that the council approves.
Now, a lot of the stuff we talked about is the positive aspects of data governance, how it can help. I just want to, with your experience, I just want to ask you, just in the final couple of minutes we've got left, in your opinion, can data governance be too heavy-handed, or does more data governance always equal more value?
I love that you asked this question, because my biggest fear in writing this book is that people will take it too far. My biggest fear in introducing a concept like data governance into a highly bureaucratic environment is that it could very easily inspire more bureaucracy, when the goal is to actually decentralize data and give more people more decision-making autonomy and give everyone more transparency. The reality is that done a certain way, data governance can just turn into another top-down effort where, IT shares a bunch of rules for what you can and cannot do with data, and then any requests for data have to go through that centralized team, and it can create even more bottlenecks, the very bottlenecks that data governance is trying to ease. And so I think when we consider data governance, there is so much about it that is unique to your organization. And that's another reason why this book is relatively short. It's because so much of governance depends on your cloud environment, the scope of your data sets, how many data domains you have. There's a lot about it that is very nuanced. What's in the book is the information that I believe everyone can use and needs, regardless of the career and industry they work in. And I think when we consider data governance in that context of bureaucracy, you always want to say, what is the least amount that I can do, in the sense of, you have to understand, again, what the goalposts are. You have to understand, what is the essential regulation that I have to follow? What are the essential domains that need representation on a governance council? What are the 4 pieces of metadata that need to be attached to all pieces of data, no matter what they are? You do have to answer those questions, and you have to figure out what is scalable. After that, you have to do a cost-benefit analysis to see if more governance is going to help or hinder your efforts, because very often doing too much is enough to derail what you've tried to establish.
So, final question, it's a follow-on question to this one, really, is how do you know when your data governance is good enough?
I think when your data governance is good enough if you have very specific quality standards for all data that you deploy and ingest in your org, and you have a very clear reason for using that data that everyone in the business can articulate. That's a very broad goal, and of course there are more goals to achieve with data throughout an organization, but I think if your colleagues, no matter their role, can explain what your vision for data is and how it's used, that you've started on the path to really building a data-driven culture, because a data-driven culture to some degree encompasses everyone. And when you can get an answer unprompted from someone in your org about how your company values and uses data, I think you know that you are on the right track. There's always room for improvement. This is an iterative process, but once that happens, you're doing something right.
Lauren, thank you very much indeed for your time today. I hope that the book is a big smash hit. On behalf of the CDO Magazine, we appreciate you providing your time today, sharing your knowledge. We certainly hope to have you come back and share your knowledge and experience again on the continuing program of data governance.
I would love that. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. For our listeners, please visit cdomagazine.tech for additional interviews. Thank you.